Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we've got a great episode in store for you all about programming devices. I think it's something that gets a lot of airtime nowadays in this social media world where there's all sorts of different types of set, drop sets, supersets, giant sets, EMOMs, AMRAPs, all this sort of stuff. And we just wanted to give our 2 cents on what they actually are, why you might use them, and how to get the most out of them, and potentially good and bad uses of them that we see in practice. So hopefully, whether you're a coach or an athlete, it gives you a little bit more understanding for the context in which they could be applied, and also how to execute them slightly better to get even more out of your training. But before we get into it, as always, a quick thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check out the website to learn more about the movement mechanics mentorship. We're just about to launch an online free group to learn more about movement mechanics, so stay tuned on socials there too. wit-fitness.com. Please use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hytro, please use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. Right, let's get into it. Programming devices.
Yeah, mate.
What are they, Rob?
I mean, we have so many, especially if you look into the bodybuilding world, you've got things from drop sets, supersets, giant sets, like all kinds of sets. It's funny because I think, especially then when you go into performance world as well, you then got a whole new element, and then you go into say CrossFit, running, like they all kind of have similar principles, and that is I think a very key thing to understand, and the fact that a lot of the time it's going to be working hard for a period and kind of not working so hard, or combining hard efforts together. So there is just so many different types, mate. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, big time. I think, like you say, a lot of them have evolved from the bodybuilding community, where the principle is trying to stress the body as hard as we can, essentially squeeze out as much as possible to get a really, really hard failure, essentially. And they serve multiple purposes in my mind. I think with anything training wise, it's always trying to elicit a training stimulus. We're trying to ask the body to adapt in a specific way. So when we use these programming devices, we're essentially trying to magnify that training stimulus as compared to a standard reps and sets and rest structure, which we could just call straight sets. If you're something like a 3x10, 5x5, something like that, we're trying to alter the stimulus that we impose on the body in pursuit of a greater response and adaptation. Other reasons that you might use programming devices are basically to trick people into working harder. It's a very similar point, but I think it helps you distract yourself from the pain sometimes, so you can actually dig a little bit deeper into the reserves if you're focused on changing exercises, changing weights, or you've got a strict, like a rest pause structure, for example. You've only got 10 or 20 seconds between reps, so you almost don't think about whether or not you can do the rep, you just do it. But also on a practical front, stuff like supersets are massive time savers. You can get a lot more work done in the same amount of time. And there's pros and cons to that, which we'll discuss later. But I think crucially in this day and age, it does make training a lot more fun and interesting. I think a lot of people are drawn towards workouts with different programming devices, because they're like, oh, what's going on here? I have to sort of think about things differently, I have to set things up differently, and it keeps the brain a little bit more occupied rather than just do your set, time your rest, do another set, time your rest, move on to the next exercise.
Do you know, I'm kind of in two minds about that, if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because like for me, if you're using one of these type of like program devices to kind of distract you from the actual work that you're performing, it probably means either one, you're not doing the correct work because you're not paying attention to what you're doing, or secondly, you're probably just not doing something you enjoy, so go and do something else. And like for me, like when I have like supersets example, I tend to really use supersets for the time saving thing. And a lot of the time it's because I get a really good pump. So mainly for like bodybuilding type of stuff. And like, I know obviously you can then start to take this into more of a performance element as well. But when I program it for clients, and a lot of my clients are mainly a lot for say strength or growth, that doing things like supersets is a nice way, especially once we get into the accessories, as I say, to kind of just keep it more fun, like you mentioned there. And for me, I tend to have the supersets as they're quite either be like upper and a lower superset rather than unless it's an upper body day, then it'll be chasing the pump necessarily. But sometimes it'd be opposing, so then they don't interfere with each other. So then it is more of a time saving element because most people don't really want to be training for more than 60 minutes. They want to be in and out. So we want to try and think how can we use some of these program devices to get the most out of it, but then not let them affect too much each other.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point on the superset front. Whether the two movements, so supersets, for those who might not know, is when you do two exercises back to back before you have a rest. And the key decision is basically how much interference or how much conflict is there between the demands that each of those movements impose on your body. So if they're using the same muscles or muscle groups, then obviously doing two exercises back to back, that second exercise is going to really suffer in terms of performance because the muscles are already tired. However, if you do like an upper body and a lower body exercise, then that interference is going to be less, even though the system will be a little bit more fatigued. The local muscular fatigue should be close to zero if there's appropriate rest between supersets.
Yeah, and I think like this can also then go into like when you go into like the Arnold days of like the push and the pull. Like he was obviously a big fan of like say chest and back and shoulders and arms and that sort of thing. And when you then go to say doing there's like a bench press and a bent over row as an example, they're opposing muscles, so they should be relatively fresh. But then when you break it down into like the stabilizers and the actual yes, okay, your lats work in the bench press, so they're getting engaged. And same vice versa when you're doing say a row, there's going to be some contractions in your chest as well. Your shoulders are working in both exercises, so your performance is massively going to be hindered compared to say if we did say bench press in your first couple of sets, then you do bent over row in a couple of sets. So it is, I guess, as we'll dive into in a bit, but like it is important to understand what your metrics are of measure, because if it's just for growth and you're looking for a more of a bodybuilding stimulus, then sweet, you can challenge yourself and get that work in, massively fatigue those muscles and get a really good work in quite a relatively short time. But if your performance metrics are more strength based, it probably isn't going to be the smartest thing to do doing.
Exactly. And we're talking about this before we started recording. From a performance perspective, say Rob's training for a powerlifting competition, he's not going to superset or pre-fatigue his main movements with something that's going to take away from his performance, because it's essentially forcing him to work at a lower percentage because there's more fatigue in the system. And like he says, it's the localness, if that's even the word, of fatigue doesn't necessarily mean the same specific muscles as the prime movers, but even the proximity has more of a carryover effect. So if you are tired using your upper body in your back with your upper body in your chest, because they're closer than legs and chest, that does actually change the impact on the body.
Well, this is a really, like, for me, a really clear indicator of why a powerlifting competition is so hard, because this is like a known thing. If you max out your squat and you end yourself on your squat, your bench press will go to shit, because your upper back, especially low bar squatters in general as well, because the way your upper back gets lit up in a squat, in a low bar squat in particular, trying to then stabilize a heavy weight over your chest is just is so much harder. So that when it then comes to performance metrics, you do have to weigh up the thing of, okay, cool, do I want to get the best squat possible right now, or do I want a potential higher score across the board? So this is understanding your body, understanding the sort of numbers that you can hit. Maybe the actual goal of the powerlifting competition, it might not be to get a really good squat bench dead. You might be saying, I really want to work on the squat and really own it, and then see what I can get in the other. So you're prioritizing. So obviously that's maybe a bit more specific to powerlifting per se, but you do have to take these considerations into case, because most people wouldn't think that a squat would then start to fatigue a bench press. But it really does.
Yeah. I think that's really important. So to distill it down a little bit, why are we using them? Get very clear on your desired stimulus. Like, what are you trying to elicit from your body? If it is hypertrophy, then you want to be picking programming devices that maximize either mechanical tension, help build in more volume in a smart or in an innovative way rather than just extending your session time. You want to maximize metabolic stress. This is why stuff like drop sets can be really effective, because the set length increases and you're just accumulating more and more the byproducts of respiration in the muscles and also muscle damage. So I have a nice bicep finisher for people that I like to program if they
Oh
want
yeah,
bigger
you
arms.
program people bicep stuff, yeah?
Right, always.
Good.
The and we call it 3 types of failure, and essentially it focuses on each type of muscle contraction. So you've got concentric, the lifting phase; isometric, the holding, like static muscle length; and eccentric, or the lowering. And that's the order in which they will fail. So you'll always fail your ability to lift a weight before you fail your ability to hold a weight still, before you fail your ability to lower a weight. So if you want to take a muscle to its absolute failure, say you're doing bicep curls, you keep curling it until you literally can't lift it anymore. And you can either sort of swing it up into place and then hold it. So you could hold your elbow at 90 degrees, so your biceps in tension, hold it for as long as you can until it starts to drop. So you've now hit isometric failure, and then you can swing it up or get a partner to assist, lift it up to the top, and then you have a controlled negative, lowering it down for ideally at least 3 seconds. And then you keep lowering it until you can't actually decelerate that lowering anymore. And if you do one set failing each of those 3 types of failure, you are going to cook your biceps in one tough set. You've got a very strong training stimulus.
That takes me back to about 2013, and like that was nearly all of my gym sessions. They were great. If I remember following someone's program, it was like Ryan Hughes or something like that, and his thing was all about like high volume, but then it used to get into like the negatives, the isometric stuff like that. It was so much fun.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the bodybuilders are great at this. Dorian Yates talks about it really well, where essentially you're just trying to, like, it's very bro sciencey and a bit meatheady, but the more you force a muscle to work beyond its capacity, the stronger the stimulus for growth will be. And like we said at the start, that might not be the best idea for performance, because you're probably going to write off using that muscle group for a couple of days. But for hypertrophy, that's a really great way to get that training stimulus.
Nice. So I think it'd be really good, since we've spoken a lot about bodybuilding, to maybe dive into a little bit more like the performance aspects, conditioning, and even movement mechanics. So maybe let's start out with some performance, because I touched on there, and I know you have as well, when we started saying about you wouldn't necessarily perform, say, supersets when you're trying to perform at your strongest, because you're going to have other elements of fatigue kicking in. So what are maybe some of the programming devices that you can use when we are looking at performance?
Sure. So I think for strength, typical devices that get used are cluster sets, where you might do heavy doubles or maybe triples with short rests in between. And if you think about what we're trying to maximize for here, we're trying to accumulate the most heavy reps we can in a training session. Like, we want to get the most practice living at the highest percentages we can. So how can we almost trick the body into producing that quality work? So cluster sets are a classic. Rest pause would be a similar one, where you might do 1 rep, rest 10 seconds, do another rep. So you're just giving your body a little bit of recovery, so you can actually do more work at that higher percentage than you could do in back-to-back reps. So you could do 3 singles, rest pause, heavier than you could do a triple. And everyone kind of intuitively understands that. But having that deliberately programmed allows you to put more weight on the bar, essentially, because you know you're just going to re-rack it between reps. Similar things would be wave loading, where you go up in weight each set, potentially dropping back down. So you might do a certain percentage, a bit heavier, then drop back down to slightly heavier than the original percentage, and go up again. And the point here is we are trying to encourage greater neuromuscular recruitment. So essentially firing a higher percentage of our muscle fibers, which is something we talk about quite a lot. And going from the heavyweight to the lightweight, it's almost like potentiation. You're asking the muscle to work to a higher percentage of its capacity, which means when we come round for the second wave, we should be able to go heavier for those lower rep or higher percentage sets.
Yeah, so like for example, if you want to put these into numbers, like say 70%, 80%, 90% in the first round, then 72, 82, 92%, and then maybe in the last one you've gone up even more to say 74, 84, 94%. So it's giving your body, as you say, like sometimes it's that I've found myself doing other exercises before a movement really helped me switch on. But then if you want to get the specificity there and actually then forget about any fatigue that might come from doing a different movement, you can then do this style of wave loading, and it's a really nice way to build up to that top load with that spectrum of specificity being as close as possible.
Exactly, we maintain the motor pattern. But that's the next thing I want to talk about. You've just touched on there, the priming for performance. So this would be where we use plyometric exercises are typically used. So you might do squat jumps before you do a heavy squat, or broad jumps or heavy kettlebell swings before you do a heavy deadlift if you're quite hingy. And the point is here is to use speed to improve that same neuromuscular efficiency. So that's always the goal really with strength. We want to get the nervous system fired up and the appropriate muscles firing at high efficiency before we go into the strength lift, so that we're primed and ready. And I remember this when I maxed out my deadlift once. I missed a lift and just went and did some heavy kettlebell swings, just a few, not even many reps, but just trying to focus on moving as quickly as possible. And then I went and made the lift just because
Nice.
my nervous system was a bit more excited.
I love how you said, yeah, I maxed out my deadlift once. I only did that once. I didn't want to end myself anymore. Do you know what's interesting now? Because it's this then kind of moves on to when you think about super maximal loading. So like, for instance, doing walkouts with a barbell on your back. So if you got a max squat, say 200 kilos, and you walk out with 220 kilos on your back, rack it, and then you then do a 200 kilo squat, it's going to feel lighter. It's still going to be challenged, but it's giving your body an opportunity to experience what these heavier loads are feeling like. Even if you then do shorter range squats, block pulls, so doing deadlifts or block bench presses, or anything where you're kind of like shortening the range of motion or just holding weights in position isometrically and giving your body the opportunity to experience what these heavier loads feel like. Because I think that's actually something which is massively underutilized in a lot of people's program, because it's like they say, I'm going to build up and I'm going to get stronger over X amount of months and so forth. But by exposing yourself to these heavier loads gives you the opportunity to kind of potentially get there a little bit quicker because your body's experienced it before, so it's not so afraid. And that's what a lot of this comes down to as well sometimes, is the ability to actually feel confident in the lift, because how you approach something is massive. And I had that hugely recently in my powerlifting competition where I failed a lift because I lacked confidence. So whereas if I started to, and I talk about then, I didn't include a lot of my super maximal stuff going into, say, doing block pulls and stuff like that, where I will be able to hit above what I've hit in competition, just so I can tell myself that I feel strong enough in my back, that I feel strong enough in my midline, my grip's there, and I've got all these things. So they're little cues to tell me. So when I do a deadlift from the floor, say, I'm sweet.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one like extra benefit of those heavy walkouts or super maximal loading is that even though you're not doing the full movement, there's a lot of body parts and muscles and connective tissue that do get exposed to a greater stimulus than they could do. So all the little stabilizer muscles, like all the upper back muscles, if you're doing a back squat, they are doing that almost the same work as they would do in a squat. So they will get that very high percentage recruitment, so that when you go into the squat, like you say, their job feels easier, which I think is psychologically a great place to be.
Yeah. So taking it into conditioning now. Condition, I know we could probably spend a long time here, so we don't want to dive too much into it. But conditioning intervals they're quite simple, right?
Yeah, I think so. So like you say, we could go into a full episode, I think, on the conditioning programming devices, and we might get somebody on maybe. But essentially, the easiest way to think about it is in cardiovascular efforts, the two key things are the intensity and the duration. And so if you think about running, you're always trying to run faster and or longer. That's essentially what it comes down to. So in a given session, you want to think about what the average or the work intensity is and how long you do it for. And any programming device is an effort to try and improve that. And this is probably the classic example of too much variation makes it hard to ensure progression. Because if you're doing different length intervals every week, it's very hard to compare your total work done at a given intensity, especially if the rest is changing as well. Whereas if you're doing a session like 10 by 400 meters with 60 seconds rest, and every week you try and improve your average split time, that's a very clear indication of what your capacity is. You've done 4 kilometers of work running, the rest is exactly the same. Are you able to do a faster speed for all 10 intervals? And there's no hiding. Whereas if you do 10 by 4, 6 by 6, 6 by 8, 9 by 300 meters, whatever it might be, it's very difficult to compare the total time at a given intensity because the speeds will vary between all of those as well. So having an understanding of what duration you want to run, what split, and then tailoring your interval sessions to be generally shorter and faster than your target race. So if you want to run 5K in 20 minutes, you want to do intervals that total less distance than 5 kilometers, but you run faster, and you want to do longer work where you're doing more distance, but you're going to have to sacrifice speed to accommodate the longer distance. And it can be as simple as that.
Well, and this is the thing as well, but that's just not sexy, right? That's just boring work. And then even when you take this back to strength training, when you boil it down to the basic fundamentals, like it's the fundamentals that work, and they should underpin everything that we do, rather than. And don't get me wrong, the fun, like the 9 by 300s, and that could be a bit of fun one day. Like that could be maybe like a second or third session, but as long as you've got your measure that you can able work off each week. And same as like when you go within CrossFit and people do rowing intervals, bike intervals, ski intervals and stuff. And it's like, like 8 by 500, 10 by 500 there. And you've got your, as you said there with the running, you've got your average splits, and it's monotonous, but it's the monotonousness that makes it that gives you the ability to improve.
Yeah, exactly. That's scientific. It's not scientific if you change everything randomly week and week, which we'll talk about more in the application, because I think that's a common pitfall with these programming devices.
So moving on to movement mechanics, I guess this is a big passion of yours to come, because we're going to now start to dive into like the priming of the movements that you're going to be doing and trying to stay as close to the actual movements as possible, grooving patterns, stuff like that. So let's kick it off.
Sure. Yeah. So if we're trying to improve movement quality or a movement pattern, using these programming devices is actually a great way that we can do so whilst continuing the focus to be on training. It's why the training stimulus is called the training stimulus and not the movement mechanics stimulus, because it is still all about the training, but how can we intelligently integrate the movement mechanics into your training program? Because it is just like we're always interested in the most direct path from A to B. So if we want to get a stronger squat, what's the most direct way? And doing a bunch of movement mechanics on a Monday and doing a squat session on a Saturday isn't the most effective way to get your squat stronger. If we've identified imbalances or some dysfunction in the way that you squat, we want to improve those, and we want them to show through in the squat. It sounds incredibly obvious, but a lot of people will take those movement qualities and be so abstract with the way that they improve them that actually, say you improve your hip internal rotation rolling around on the floor, that doesn't mean your hip internal rotation is going to be improved whilst you squat. So having the proximity to the main movement pattern, so that means doing it very close within the session, has a much greater carryover. So it means you're saving time, but you're also improving the efficacy of these movement mechanics. So common ways to do it, obviously everyone understands the benefit of warmups. So getting your body moving well as it starts to warm up and get ready for the session. You want to explore the ranges of motion and positions you're going to be training hard in that warm up. But also, as Rob touched on there, priming, activating, whatever you want to call it, you want to prepare the body to use the new and improved movement mechanics just before it does the main movement. So this could be a superset where you do a stretch or a balance or a lunge just before you do your working squat sets. But we can also do cool things like pyramids. So if there's one particular mechanic that is holding back your performance, say one muscle doesn't work very well, you could do a stretch and then a balance, a stretch, then a balance, then a lunge, a stretch, then a balance, then a lunge, then a squat. So in each layer or level of the pyramid, you're getting closer and closer to the movement that you're trying to improve. But every time you're just layering in one extra level of complexity. And this is very similar to the principle behind weightlifting complexes, where you might slowly, the classic warm up in weightlifting, where you go from a high hang to a low hang to the floor, from a muscle to a power to a squat. You're slowly adding levels of complication. So your body and brain have a much greater chance of integrating those movement mechanics into the movement that actually matters. And I think that principle often gets lost, where you just think, I'm going to do this stretch at the start and then it's done. That will help and that will be beneficial, but we're missing out on so much potential carryover by doing them separately. Whereas actually, if you have movement mechanics exercises as part of the training, you can load them, you can progress them, and you could put them into a work, like not just the warm up, you can put them into the work chunk of your session. The way that you move is going to benefit so much faster. And there's absolutely no reason why you can't load these movements up to get pretty heavy. And they should be taxing, because at the end of the day, you want those new mechanics to hold up under fatigue at high weight, or we'd say like at the speed of sport. So obviously this is something I'm very passionate about, but I think using programming devices is a great way to get all those neurological benefits as well as the physiological ones.
Yeah, and for me, like seeing this in action a lot of time, and what you say about loading up like these heavy these movement mechanics exercises essentially, and it's just making stuff a bit more tailored to you and your weaknesses, to your sport demands or whatever it is. And like, instead of just having a generic step up, you might have a more specific step up tailored to, you might have to move laterally, you might have to rotate into it to then work on the weakness that you have, that you can then start to load. As you said, go with a heavy goblet, so you will really start to load up. But maybe at the start of the session, you might have done them body weight. Then later on in the session, you've reintroduced them again, maybe after your squat or something like that, and have them heavier loaded. Or you might have them heavier loaded, and then you go into your squat. So it's like, it's a really interesting way to think about it, because one thing that you've obviously always said as well is like, it's not just the warm up; it is the training, and that was a massive thing that I took away from it, is when you start to put things actually into practice and load these movements up, you start to realize a lot of the benefits from them a lot quicker as well, rather than, because at the end of the day, we want to kind of come away from body weight and start to load up these movements as quickly as we can. But we want to make sure that we can move through them properly first without load, so that when we are loading them, we're not just going to go into compensatory patterns and stuff like that to kind of make it easier, because then you're negating the purpose of maybe a crossover step up. And do you know what I mean? So it's that.
Yep.
Yeah,
I think that's a great explanation. And I think to give it a little bit more, or bring it to light a little bit more, if we identify a powerlifter is missing hip internal rotation and they want to squat 200 kilos, the goal is to get that hip internally rotating better in a 200 kilo squat. And one of the principles we use at the training stimulus is that we should always work as high up the spectrum of specificity, so as close to sport as we can, provided we still get that training stimulus. So if the training stimulus is to improve hip internal rotation, if we do a 190 kilo squat, we're probably not getting better internal rotation than we got at 200 kilos. So the question in programming is, how far away from that 200 kilo squat do we need to come to guarantee better hip internal rotation. It might be we can work at 100 kilos. It might be we have to go to body weight, or we have to use a different exercise than a squat. But we only go as far as we need to, with the view to always come back up that spectrum of specificity, so that when we get the hip internally rotating better, we want it to be happening in heavy squats as soon as we can. So even though the exercises can look abstract, the reason they are is because that's an exercise where we can guarantee the training stimulus is occurring, with a view to reintegrate that new movement mechanic higher up the spectrum of specificity towards the sporting goal at the end, or the movement goal at the end.
Yeah, and I think it's a really nice. When I think of weightlifting, and like when you mentioned there about going through your couple of positions to the floor and then going through the muscle snatch, the power snatch, to the full squat snatch, it's a really clear indicator whenever you watch a weightlifter warm up, and you can see those positions and you can see the speed start to come, you can see everything starting to switch on better, and it's they're staying as close to that specificity as possible. They're staying as close to the movement as they can, so that they're not wasting time. They're just doing the work necessary to move on. Which I guess then when we talk about them replicating demands of the sport, this means we can start to think about, are we going to be doing something that's interfering with our sport? So like if you're, say, doing weightlifting and you're warming up for the snatch, but then you go and, say, do a heavy back squat before a snatch, that could be a good thing, right? If your goal is to maybe prime the legs, but is it going to be a good thing if you're trying to max out your snatch? You need a strong upper back, you need some strong shoulders and stuff like that, and then maybe the squat will start to interfere with that.
Yeah, exactly. I think the key thing when we're using programming devices to replicate the demands of sport is having a clear understanding of the context under which the movement or performance will be performed. So, like Rob was talking about there, if you are a weightlifter, there's a very specific set of circumstances which you're going to perform your lifts, and you need to be able to perform them in that set of circumstances. There's no point only maxing out your snatch in EMOMs, because you don't get to do EMOMs in competition. And that sounds very obvious, but when we take it into other sports, then it gets a little bit more cloudy in terms of, obviously, the most obvious example would be CrossFit or functional fitness competitions. And it's a really challenging sport to program for, because the context can be almost anything. So you might have to do 1 rep maxes completely fresh. With long waits between attempts, you might have to do 1 rep maxes as part of a workout with fatigue from cardio machines, with fatigue from gymnastics, with fatigue from other barbell movements, with grip fatigue. There's all sorts of things that could go into interfering with the skill that you're about to execute. So having acknowledgement and understanding of the context with which you need to reproduce those skills means that we can be smart with how we set up our programming devices to most accurately replicate them. Because, like, I think this is a common gripe I have with CrossFit programs. It's almost like a random movement generator and a random rep number generator and a random time cap generator. Just chuck it out there and see what happens. And that will have some benefit to CrossFit, because, when you turn up to a competition, that might be what they've done. But in terms of training, something we always say is the body adapts through progressive overload, and that isn't progressive overload. We need to have some semblance of consistency, so the body knows in what direction it needs to adapt. So if you are doing a workout, how are you progressing it? Are you just trying to do the same workout faster? Are you adding reps? Are you adding repeats? Are you adding more different movements into the pre-fatigue before you get to the main movement? I think having at least a little bit of consciousness around that means the programs are going to be far more effective and safer, because you don't get that random hotspot overload when all the movements are shoulder movements in a 3-day window and you don't do any legs, for example. So yeah, I think that's my bit on replicating the demands of sport.
Yeah, it is a challenging thing, and I think this is also where when you look at people that say that are training within say functional fitness and they've identified weaknesses and then they do more work on that weakness and let other things kind of sit by the side. So, because they understand, especially when it comes to progressive overload, is in we need to have a little bit more attention and the ability to load something and maybe more frequently to get better at it. So then other things will kind of have to kind of sit to the side. So I guess we've kind of dived into a lot of the, in a way, why we use them. So
Yeah.
maybe it might be really cool to kind of dive into now how to use them, because
Yeah.
there are so many options to use, and it can be very, say, cloudy, as you said, like to kind of choose the right ones at the right time.
Spot on. So I think to summarize my thoughts on how to use them, I would say sparingly. So for maximum effectiveness or efficacy of a program, you don't need any of these. Like you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
get incredible results without any sort of crazy programming devices. You can just use straight sets. However, that's perfect world situation where you have unlimited training time and perfectly compliant athletes who just do exactly what they're told and are able to push themselves as hard as is necessary in every session. So that's perfect world. We don't live in the perfect world. But as we alluded to earlier, the main consideration for me is the more different programming devices you use, the harder it is to track your progress. So the harder it is to get a clear picture of your key metrics. So say you're trying to get your bench press up, but you're never doing bench press just on its own. You might have some movement mechanics work before it. You might do a superset with an upper body movement one day. You might do a superset with a lower body movement. You might have it pre-fatigue with the unilateral work. You're not actually getting clear data on how your bench press is performing. So unless you have a singular bench press unit in your program, you're not going to be able to track your performance easily over the long term. So this isn't such a big issue if you're just focused on hypertrophy, because essentially in hypertrophy, if you are really challenging muscle groups with appropriate intensity and volume, they're going to grow. But if you are focused on performance, then having a clear picture on how your performance is trending over time is super, super important. So you're making your job harder to do that if you use too many and varied programming devices.
Yeah, and I think like it doesn't. From what I've kind of taken from what you said there as well. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't then mean you need to have the same exact warm up every single time before your bench press. That's not what we're saying. But your levels of fatigue going into the bench press is key, because when we're doing some priming exercises and we might say something simple like maybe some rowing, some push ups, and I don't know, something else, right? And so it's just something really quite simple. A bit of aerobic work, some upper body pushing, and then going into the bench press. Then the next week you might just do, say, some push-ups and maybe some plyometric push-ups. So if you're going in feeling relatively fresh still, you should still be able to perform and have it as a consistent measure. But then if you're doing a full metcon before you're getting into your bench press, so then you turn your, say, rowing and push-ups into a 21:15 for time,
Yeah.
then it's going to affect you, because then your heart rate's going to be higher. It means everything's going to be slightly different. So unless you give yourself the legit amount of time to recover, but even in that case, you still have got to bear in mind that your performance may be hindered because you've exerted yourself so much in, say, the priming bit, that you've primed yourself too much and you've actually gone into work rather than actually doing the work that counts.
Yeah, spot on. And the effects can go both ways, right? So touched on it earlier with that EMOM snatch example. A lot of people PB in EMOMs, and you would think that when you've got less than a minute to recover between reps, that's a harder situation. But it's maybe a topic for another podcast. But this is extremely common that people perform their best with slightly less rest, potentially with a little bit of fatigue in the system. So again, it's not necessarily bad. It's not necessarily hindering your performance, but the point is it's inconsistent and you're not comparing apples with apples. So from a performance perspective, you need to have those cornerstone sessions where it is apples every week. It's 10 by 400 meters on the track. It is 5 by 5 bench or whatever it might be, so that you know that you're getting better without any room for misinterpretation. Yeah, I think that's the key point there.
So I guess in simple terms, right, is the simpler the better, right?
Yeah, for me, like, we get the optimal program and then we make it as fun and interesting as it needs to be to maintain compliance. That's how I like to do my programs, because I'd rather get someone got results. The other way to go about it would just put in all the things that somebody
Yeah.
likes and then just enough to ensure they make slow progress. Neither's right or wrong. It's a personal preference thing. But I think, yeah, at the end of the day, most people are training to get a given result. So if you can get them to that result, that's best. But obviously, enjoyment and fun are key considerations that,
Yeah.
don't get me wrong, I do plenty of fun training sessions every now and again. But I don't kid myself that I'm making best use of time to work towards a specific outcome.
Yeah, because I guess if you're turning up, it's better than not turning up, right? And if you're
Yeah,
not enjoying the work, as I kind of alluded to at the start, you're either doing the wrong work altogether because you shouldn't be doing what you're doing, because you probably do it because you think you should be doing it, or there is probably another way of actually getting more out of it. And like for me, and I kind of, as you said, if you're looking for growth, you're looking for hypertrophy in training in general, you can be a little bit more free flowing with maybe exercise selection and stuff like that, and using a lot of these tools. It makes it more fun. It keeps the intensity up, and because what you'll actually find is actually using some of these tools when you're doing, say, looking for growth, they're a really good way to keep intensity high rather than resting for too long in between sets, getting distracted by your phone, getting distracted by others. You get, say, X amount of minutes worth of solid work because you have to do the work. So it can be a really cool time, a cool use of these tools. But then when you start to get into a lot, as we've mentioned here, with like the performance and the other side of stuff, they have to be used appropriately, and they then, as you said, use sparingly, so that we can have clear understanding of what we're tracking and if we're tracking it correctly.
exactly. And I think that leads naturally on to the mixed modal point that we had a little rant on earlier, or I had a little rant on earlier. If you are using these programming devices for mixed modal work, make sure you've got a good handle on the key variables that you're tracking. So this might be the number of reps of a given movement pattern, so a press pattern or a specific movement, like, say, how many handstand push-ups are you doing per week? Is that progressing over time? And if you have a piece in a session which is just 5 sets of handstand push-ups, that's very easy. But if you have handstand push-ups sprinkled throughout the week at random different places, in a workout here, a max set there, then it's much harder to keep track of that, which means it's hard to keep track of whether it's improving, but also it's hard to keep track of whether it's going to get overloaded. So you might end up in that nightmare week where you end up doing 300 handstand push-ups
Yeah.
and the previous week you did 100. That's not a situation that the body is going to enjoy. So I think focusing on a few key variables and ensuring they progress over time is the way to go with the mixed modal stuff.
And also, especially within the mixed modal stuff, is in understanding maybe the previous day's work and how that affects the fatigue going into the next day. Because something like, for instance, you're doing a load of skiing on the ski erg one day, going then into then, say, some handstand push-up stuff the next day, you might still be pretty fatigued in your lats, in your shoulders, all from, say, you might have done, say, 10 by 500 on the ski. So if you've got that consistent measure of saying, okay, I generally do ski work the day before a handstand push-up, then sweet, that's your measure of saying this, how that. But if on one particular week you had this ski workout out in a random way, when we talk about the random wads being just thrown in at you, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you're going into competitive, say, functional fitness and like CrossFit, that might happen. But if you're looking on a week-to-week basis, and you can say, okay, this week my handstand push-ups went to absolute shit, and then you say, oh, but actually I did a really heavy ski workout the day before. Okay, let me bear that in mind for next week. When I approach this next week, it does this compare to 2 weeks before, and what does it look like compared to last week? And then you can actually use that ski workout and say, actually, this is how the ski fatigues my shoulders and how it fits. So then it's more data for you. So nothing's a bad thing necessarily if you can use the information in an appropriate way. So even really random stuff is fine as long as it's tracked and understood, then it can work. But then you have to understand that you've then sacrificed a week's worth of potential handstand push-up gains because you've had this random ski workout thrown in.
Yeah, great point. And that's the next thing I wanted to talk about actually, was just consistency and using these programming devices consistently. So interference is fine. Like you say, going from a ski workout into a handstand push-up workout is allowed and it's fine. But if it's different every week, it's just another variable that you're not controlling for. So if we're trying to be scientific and make meaningful, intentional progress, and we're changing all these variables, we actually don't know what's working and what's not. So one week you might have a great handstand push-up session. You think, oh yeah, it's because I did this stretch before I did my handstand push-ups. But what you're not realizing is that you took out a workout the day before which had shitloads of shoulder to overheads or other press work, so your shoulders were just a little bit fresher from not having that. So have your handstand push-up actually got better or not? You're not sure. So whereas if there was always that same workout or doing the same body parts the day before, then at least it's an even playing field and you know what's making the difference. Because like if you think about running an experiment, you only want to change one thing, and then you can be much surer that that one thing changing is the cause of your results. Whereas if 5, 10, 15 things are changing at the same time, you're never sure what's actually causing the result, for better, for worse. So we can't be intentional with the changes that we're instilling in someone's body.
That kind of reminds me of just like, like transformations and stuff like that, when people like they start like this change to their life of like, okay, I want to lose X amount of weight and stuff like that, but then they throw in, I'm going to go on date, and this is talking from previous experience, so this is not just saying, this is not talking down to anyone, is in like, you're not losing any weight, and then suddenly you go on daily walks, you do cardio, you're more consistent with your lifting, you're nutritious, but it's like, which one of those is actually making you lose weight? And because
Yeah.
you've gone all in at the start, which fair enough, if you can maintain it, then cool, crack on. But if you've thrown them all in, what is the biggest lever that you're getting the most from? And until you kind of stop one of them, and actually then why not actually only start one of them or maybe two of them at the start, rather than throwing them all in and then kind of
Exactly.
saying so.
But so if you jump straight to, like, air quotes, perfect, the only direction you can travel is backwards
Yeah,
and away from perfect. You can only get worse. So if you use all your weapons in your arsenal, then things are only going to, your rate of progress at the very best is only going to get slower, but you're probably going to regress, and then you're left scrambling, thinking, oh, I know I couldn't hold that perfect lifestyle. So you're putting yourself into an unsustainable
yeah.
situation. Like, it's always better to go a little bit slower that you can sustain over the long term.
Yeah, and then even like when we're then putting into like the performance stuff, like going up, then that, starting out with your one set with rest, one set with rest, and then adding in your supersets or whatever, and then doing whatever necessary, and then going back to your one set with rest, one set, because it's a way of then reigniting again maybe some gains that you've now because you've gone away from maybe that one set with a bit of rest, not too far, but you've gone away just enough that when you come back to it, you're like, oh, this extra rest is now giving me some extra fire that you can then actually push that a little bit harder. And it's a big experiment, like as you mentioned there, but it's as long as you are tracking that data to understand then that this is what I'm doing to see if it works, it can give you a really good understanding. So I
Yeah.
guess some of the takeaways from today are there are many ways that we can focus on like these programming devices, right?
Yeah, we can manipulate weight, reps, rest, range of motion, stability, all these different types of things in pursuit of a better training stimulus. But just we need to do it with, well, we need to be conscious of our target training stimulus so that we can choose the right variables to manipulate, and or a single variable to manipulate would probably be a better way to do it.
So always being clear on your target is
Yeah.
probably the number one thing, because for me is if you're clear, then it's easily managed.
Yeah, spot on. I think next takeaway would be that progressive overload, if I can say it, still definitely applies even with all these complicated programming devices. So just try not to add so much complexity that it makes it very difficult to ensure that you are progressing for whatever goal you're progressing towards. And I think the summary is that consistent challenge at an appropriate rate of progression is what we're trying to achieve. And we should use these devices as we want, but in pursuit of that. Don't let these like fun devices become the goal. We're not just here to
Yeah.
try every different set style. We're here to actually train towards something in particular. And just before we wrap, I just want to give a shout out to, or well done to Rob, who's currently dealing with the vid, and I think he's been an absolute soldier getting the episode out.
Yeah.
It's all for you guys, all for
Yeah,
the listeners.
appreciate that, mate. Yeah, so I apologise for any brain foggy moments. I've tried to keep this on mute as much as I can. I had to keep checking that I'm not on mute when I'm talking. So yeah, no, right. Thank you very much for listening, guys. We hope you got something cool out of today, and also we hope you understand that we want you to experiment with a lot of these things, because a lot of these things, they are cool, they are fun, but do them with purpose, because then you know if what you're doing is working or not. Because that's the big thing. And if you're just trying to get bigger, then just do them all. Just crack on, do you, get growth, get gains. It's all good. But if you're really trying to measure your progress, probably not the smartest of things. But as always, thank you very much for listening. If you did enjoy this episode, please do share it with others. Share it on your social media. We really do appreciate it. Tag us at lunge.lift. As always, you can head over to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. And as always, thank you very much for listening. We really do appreciate each and every one of you, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.